Okay, so we're diving deep today into the motherlode, right? The Chilcot report, all about the UK and the Iraq War. Specifically, you've given me sections 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, Reconstruction.
Right, right. But well, the inquiry itself, they define reconstruction so broadly. It's almost overwhelming. We're talking infrastructure, central services, the whole shebang. Institution building, even economic reform.
Whoa, hold on. It's like rebuilding a house from the inside out during an earthquake.
Yeah, pretty much. And the inquiry doesn't shy away from the pre-invasion jitters either, like the economic stuff, global oil prices, the oil for food program, all huge concerns right from the get-go.
Yeah, so not just rebuilding, but rebuilding on what? A fault line, basically.
Exactly. And with millions of Iraqi lives literally depending on how it all shook out.
So what was the UK government even aiming for here? What was their best case scenario for a post-Saddam Iraq?
Officially, they wanted a democratic, stable, and prosperous Iraq, free from WMDs, not a threat to its neighbors, all that jazz. Plus, upholding human rights for the Iraqi people, naturally.
Right, the ideal. But given all the existing problems even before the invasion, how realistic were those goals?
Well, the inquiry, it doesn't really get into specific doubts from officials back then, but you see this awareness of the massive task ahead. Like, take the oil for food program. There was serious planning to keep it running even during an invasion. That tells you something about their priorities.
Yeah, trying to prevent total collapse while setting up a whole new system. Did they grasp how huge this undertaking would be?
You see this evolving understanding. The inquiry mentions early planning involving DFED, the Department for International Development, and the Treasury.
Right, so multiple players from the start. Was there a clear sense of who was in charge?
This is where it gets interesting. See, early 2003 DFAD, they asked for a ton of money, specifically for humanitarian aid, but they made it clear. Reconstruction costs. That was a whole other beast, a long-term, expensive beast.
Well, two separate problems, and I'm guessing only so much money to throw around.
And then there's ORHA, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. This is where they started to put some structure to it all, at least initially.
So ORHA, this Office of Reconstruction, they were the boots on the ground, right, in those crucial early days. Did it actually work out the way they planned?
Well, they were supposed to deliver that immediate humanitarian help, keep things running,
Yeah.
but also prep for the long haul, the actual rebuilding. And, well, let's just say, reading the inquiry, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
What were the biggest bumps they hit?
Just imagine the logistics. You're trying to recruit experts, civilian folks, and get them into a war zone. Infrastructure shot, security's changing by the hour. It was a nightmare.
And on top of that, they're trying to build a new government, a whole society out of the wreckage. What was the UK's role in all this chaos?
Oh, they were trying to shape things, definitely. The inquiry mentions these internal debates, like how should the UK even fit into ORHA? They wanted enough people in the right spots, to influence decisions, make sure their objectives were met.
So, a balance, get things done, but make sure the UK has a say. But didn't ORHA, it didn't last that long, did it?
You're right on the money. The Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, that came in pretty quickly.
Right.
U.S.-led, of course.
That shift, ORH to CPA, that feels significant, more than just a name change, right?
Hugely significant. It marked a shift. We're not talking just occupation anymore, but long-term administration. And for the UK, that meant their role, their influence, it all had to change too.
Did they butt heads with the U.S. over how to run things?
There were definitely tensions, especially when it came to the big one, Iraqi oil money. The CPA, they set up this development fund for Iraq, the DFI, and the UK. They were all over transparency, wanted to make sure that money actually reached the Iraqi people.
The age-old problem, right? Getting aid where it's actually needed.
Yeah.
How'd they try to influence the U.S. on that?
They pushed hard for oversight, clear mechanisms to track where the oil revenue was going. They knew that without controls, it could easily vanish. Corruption, you name it.
It's a tightrope, though, isn't it? Quick aid versus making sure it's not misused. Did they manage to find that balance?
From what I'm reading in the inquiry, it was a constant struggle. There were disagreements about the whole pace of reconstruction. Some wanted quick wins, something to show off, Others argued for slow and steady, even if it took longer.
Trying to lay a foundation while the house is still on fire, kind of thing?
Exactly. And the UK. They seem to be trying to bridge that gap. Visible progress is important, but so are solutions that actually last.
And all this is happening while things are literally exploding around them. The violence, the instability, how'd that impact their efforts?
It was an uphill battle every single day. The CPA is trying to establish an Iraqi government, a new constitution, all while an insurgency is brewing. And the UK is right there with them, trying to build up these Iraqi institutions, trying to give them a sense of ownership, even as things are falling apart.
It's just the scale of it all. Where did the money even come from? Who was actually paying for all of this?
It was a bit of a patchwork, honestly. The U.S. was the biggest donor, obviously, but the UK, they chipped in a hefty sum too. Plus, you had contributions from other countries, international organizations. And of course, the idea was to eventually have Iraqi oil revenue funding its own reconstruction.
Right, using their own resources to rebuild. But was there ever enough? It sounds like a bottomless pit of need.
Yeah, funding was a constant headache. The inquiry makes that clear. Every penny scrutinized, debated.
Because you're trying to do it all at once, right?
Restore basic services, water, electricity, the essentials, but also invest in the long term. It's that classic dilemma.
Band-aids versus surgery kind of thing.
Exactly. And the UK, they were trying to balance those competing demands. Keep the lights on, but also build something that lasts.
You know, one thing that really struck me in these documents, there's a lot of focus on UK businesses. It wasn't just about rebuilding Iraq, but getting British companies in on the action. Was that purely economic, or was there a strategic element to it?
Oh, it was definitely strategic. Getting those contracts, it gave the UK a foothold, influence,
Yeah.
a chance to shape things in a post-Saddam Iraq.
Playing the long game. But were they facing pushback? I imagine other countries wanted a piece of that pie.
Absolutely. Yeah. The inquiry actually goes into quite a bit of detail about those challenges. It was a competitive environment, to say the least. The U.S. dominated, naturally. And it wasn't always easy for UK firms to get a look in, even with government support.
Sounds like a whole other layer of complexity on top of everything else.
Right. And on top of all that, the UK was also really keen on these bigger systemic changes. They knew that true reconstruction, it wasn't just about physical stuff.
What do you mean? What else were they pushing for?
Well, they understood they had to address the underlying issues,
Yeah.
things like reforming the Iraqi public administration, no small feat tackling corruption, trying to get the Iraqi economy in a stable footing, huge long-term goals. And from what we can tell, progress was slow, often frustrating.
It feels like, I don't know, this constant tension between short-term needs and long-term vision.
Exactly. And then, always in the background, the violence, the instability. It makes you appreciate the sheer scale of the task they faced.
It really does. And it makes you think, is there ever a right way to rebuild a nation?
That's the question, isn't it? The inquiry doesn't offer any easy answers,
Yeah.
but it does highlight just how complex, how messy this whole process is. And it reminds us, I think, that the legacy of conflict, it doesn't just disappear overnight. It takes time, resources, and a whole lot of effort to even begin to heal those wounds.
It's been fascinating, to be honest. This deep dive into the Chilcot report, these specific sections on reconstruction, it's given me a whole new perspective.
It's one thing to read about it in the news,
Mhm.
years later,
Mm.
but to actually dig into the details, the thinking at the time,
Mhm.
it really brings it home, doesn't it?
It really does. And for anyone listening who wants to dive deeper themselves, we'll be sure to link to the full text of the Chilcot report in the show notes. It's dense, but it's worth it.
Definitely worth a read.
Yeah.
And it's not just history, right? These questions, these challenges, they're just as relevant today as they were back then.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll leave it there for today, but join us next time for another deep dive because there's always more to uncover.